I think most of us, when we think of a myth, we probably think of fairy tale, but there's another definition too. We get the word myth from mythos, a story or set of stories relevant to or having a significant truth or meaning for a particular culture, religion, or other group. Could that be true of the American founding? A set of stories that communicate a basic value or truth?
I'm very pleased to welcome Nate Weiland to the program today. Nate is a classical educator in the great state of Ohio, and he writes excellent pieces on Substack. You can find him at If You Can Keep It, which is a great name, by the way. A little shout out
Thank you.
to Benjamin Franklin. Nate, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is a conversation that I've been wanting to have for a little bit since I read your piece, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and I want to pull it up here just so I get the title right. It's called American Myth, question mark, the memory of George Washington. The the title caught my attention. It's intriguing. You're asking a question here. Is there an American myth? And I'm wondering right here at the onset, I guess, but before we dive into this, what is it that got you thinking about American myth?
Yeah, well, thank you. And I I started thinking about this. I read this book I have here, The Memory of 76, and that's the book that I reference in the piece by Michael, I believe it's Michael Haddam. I had to read this for a graduate course that I'm taking on the founding. And and before I go too much further than that, I love my graduate program. I love my professor, and that's all been a wonderful experience. So I don't want to besmirch that in any way. And my professor acknowledged like there's some issues with this book. He had other goals with us reading it. The book is about how Americans have looked to the founding at different points for inspiration, for various political agenda throughout our history, and that's true. Think of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 407 years ago, takes you back to the Declaration of Independence. Um, Martin Luther King Jr., of course, is holding up the Declaration as he calls it the promissory note that has not been cashed or has insufficient funds. So that premise of the book, I think, is true, and it's a good one. And so that's what the goal with the book was to kind of trace that movement as we head towards this watermark anniversary here this weekend. Regarding the myth, though, what I took issue with was sort of the early stages of the book. And so I guess I just ask, like, when I say myth, what comes to mind to you or to the average person? I think most of us, when we think of a myth, we probably think of fairy tale
Mhm.
or legend, tall tale, maybe something that's been concocted to explain a phenomenon that we don't understand. Like, why do we have
Mhm.
lightning? Oh, well, that's Zeus. He's up in the clouds throwing thunderbolts. Like
Sure.
that's what we normally think of with myth. So, but there's another definition too. We get the word myth from mythos, which is kind of a little bit different here. So I wrote down two definitions for mythos. It's a pattern of basic values and attitudes of a people, characteristically transmitted through myth and art, or a story or set of stories relevant to or having a significant truth or meaning for a particular culture, religion, or other group. So when you take one of those definitions, could that be true of the American founding? A set of stories that communicate a basic value or truth? Yeah, I think that's pretty fair, and that's kind of how we've always viewed the founding: is that there are certain values of the American way that are communicated. The issue that I took with the way that, in particular, Washington is presented in Haddam's book is it seems like Haddam might be equivocating a little bit of he's presenting it as he's tracing the mythology of this transmission of values across time. But every time he does that, he's using kind of fiction, which would suggest that he's actually talking about the made up fairy tale part. And so he spends way more time on the cherry tree to explain how Washington became this larger than life figure. And so that's where I think he's playing a game with you a little bit of what does he actually mean by myth? Is it just that George Washington is a story, the story of the person is communicating certain American values to preserve, or is he a fictional character that we've invented um, for various agenda over time? So that's kind of what I took issue with, and the reason that that stood out to me was with it's he goes to the cherry tree right away as
Hmm.
explaining how he gets this larger than life persona. And the title of this chapter, I believe, is called Creating the Father of the Country,
Hmm.
which would suggest then that Washington didn't do anything to make himself the father of the country. It's actually he had to be created. It was passive for him. And so that's what I see it as an issue here of you might say that you're talking about the way that we tell our stories and the values behind them. What you're actually doing, though, is you're calling it a fiction.
Hmm.
If not explicitly, I think that was implied there.
Hmm. It it seems that way to me. It feels that way. Um, Before we get into some of the things that you wrote about in terms of defending, and I don't know that Washington needs any defense really, but I think you do a really good job of listing out particular things that would show, for an example, that he was not myth in terms of the definition being this made up story. Before we get there, I want to know your opinion on something. Do you feel like there is, I don't want to ask a leading question here. Let me ask it this way. Why present the life of Washington? If you're the author of this book or if you're anybody, why present the life of Washington as though it is myth defined from the meaning of it being a made up story? Why would you present the life of Washington as a made up story?
Yeah, I of course can't get into the author's head
Sure,
directly,
right,
but
right.
what I do think is that there's something special about Washington that makes him a exceptional figure. And I tried to get at that a little bit. And Haddam actually refers to Washington as a performance artist, and so this routine in Washington's life of he's given authority, he does whatever he was called to do, and then he gives it right back and he goes
Hmm.
home.
Hmm.
He calls that performance art. I don't think that is true. I think that is something that is uniquely exceptional about George Washington. You can go throughout the annals of history, you don't really find that.
Hmm.
It's you kill off your rivals, you consolidate your power, and
Hmm.
you install yourself as a dictator.
You're
That is the
king,
course
right?
of, yes, yeah, and that's what Washington repeatedly has the opportunity to do, and he refuses every single time. I think there's many things that make the American Revolution unique in history. I think that is kind of the defining legacy of the revolution, of what sets it apart.
Hmm.
Every other revolution ends in tyranny and bloodshed, from
Hmm.
Greece all the way up to the Bolsheviks and the communist revolutions. That's the normal course.
Hmm.
This idea that you would actually give back power in
Hmm.
order to preserve the republic, it's really unique. It's that's a uniquely American idea too, I think, because nobody else really does that. And so I think if you can break the link between that ideal, that is what kind of sets the American Revolution apart, and reality, if you can break that, I think you've undermined the whole American identity there.
Hmm.
And so I don't want to be alarmist or anything like that, but
Hmm.
it seems like it's kind of a subversive effort to break this link between what is uniquely American about the revolution.
Hmm. And I think in your piece, you do a good job of keeping that link together, not allowing it to be broken. Um, you're 100% correct that when Washington gives back power, I agree with you. I don't think there's a performance here. I don't think he's on stage trying to, win approval from the crowd. This is something that's in him. These are values. These are principles that he believes in, that he is that he's gone to great lengths fighting for. All right, so let's get into some of your defense. That is one of your pieces where in I don't want to say in your opinion because it's not just your opinion. I believe it's fact that Washington is not he's not performing here. This is something that is inside of him, and you explain that well. How else can you describe or explain that Washington's actions are not mythology from being pretend, but they are something that are in him deeply?
Mhm. I heard the great pastor Kevin DeYoung, who is a big enthusiast of the American Revolution, and I heard him talking recently about Washington and this idea of performance art, and he said even let's take it at its most cynical. Let's say it is a performance. He doesn't actually believe in the things he's doing. If you keep on doing it, at what point does that just become who you are? And so if it's just a performance or he keeps on doing it, well, you got to give him some credit here that this has to be part of his character.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that. I think at minimum, it's one thing to put on a stunt one time. Julius Caesar famously does that at a religious festival where Mark Antony is trying to put the crown on his head, and he keeps saying, "No, no, no, I could never." Fully intending to
Mm-hmm.
eventually take absolute power and doing so. That's one time. Washington keeps on doing it. And so that's got to be recognized of there is a level of this is just who you are.
Mm-hmm.
At the same token, I mentioned this. When he surrenders his commission, he goes down to Annapolis in 1783 in the winter. He surrenders his commission to, I believe, the president of the Congress was Thomas Mifflin at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Thomas Mifflin was part of what's called the Conway Cabal to overthrow Washington and to remove him from supreme command of the American forces. And so here you have this man who has just led the defeat of the British Empire, uh, has already had several attempts by his army, by the citizens to make him king. And not only does he refuse all of those things, but he goes in person to Annapolis and he humbles himself before the man that was his political rival, who had just tried to overthrow him in really one of the darkest periods of the war early on when
Mm-hmm.
it really seemed like the American Revolution was going to fizzle out and be defeated. He instead goes and he surrenders his commission to that man. Imagine Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Julius Caesar. What are they doing to that guy?
Mm-hmm.
He'd be.
Right, right.
It would not be good for him. And
Yeah.
so I think that speaks to a level of character that is more than just an act, because
Mm-hmm.
nobody wants to do something like that. Go and submit yourself to a rival who has treated you poorly in the past. That would take an incredible strength of character.
Thank you for saying that because this is a very important thing to point out. And you've got Mifflin, who we don't really hear a lot about. I don't know that people know that he was the president of the Congress. I don't know that they know his involvement in the Conway cabal, which I think is what makes history so exciting when you have an opportunity to dive into the names and who these people were and this role that they played, and they all weren't best of pals. They all didn't gather in Philadelphia as the best of friends, there were these
Right.
little internal power struggles going on. And
Mhm.
it speaks to Washington's character and the values that he had, where um, he didn't have necessarily this ego that he had to support and inflate. And he had the ability to go to Mifflin and hand in his sword, as it were. Uh, this man who attempted to have him removed. You, when you were defining mythos, you talked about it being this value that's transferred um, in terms of mythology. I think if we were to look at the American founding in that light as a mythology, not as fake, but as values to be transferred, and just spent some time focusing on that event where Washington goes to Mifflin and says, "Here, I'm resigning," and speak to the value of that. Just the lessons in that story alone that we could mine, and how our
Mhm.
life could become better than what it is. I I I I think that if we were to tap into those values, it might make things a little different. Agree or disagree?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And Washington, it's not performance art, but he is setting a precedent too. And so, what does he do at the end of his second term?
Mm-hmm.
He goes and he retires to his farm, and
Mm-hmm.
that's been the norm for presidents ever since,
Mm-hmm.
except for FDR, of course. And so we had to constitutionalize that after FDR because that's what you do, and so that's what a president is supposed to do. You give up power and you have a peaceful transition to your successor, even though he might be of a different party from you,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and uh, and so you even have to give over the presidency to one of your fiercest rivals. So,
Mm-hmm.
in that sense, I think we've maintained some of that. And now, to your point, though, I agree that we've certainly fall short of that, and in many ways, especially Washington's farewell and this call for amity and rejection of partisanship. I think that would probably be the most obvious way that
Mm-hmm.
life might be a little bit better if we could put aside those things and unite as Americans, as
Mm-hmm.
he calls us to in that address. But that would be, yeah, certainly one that we fall short.
Mm-hmm.
If I could just back up, you mentioned something that reminded me. I went to Grove City College for my undergrad, and my favorite professor there, Dr. Jason Edwards, took his modern civ class. And the first time I really heard this, and I think it's such a good one, is your defining figure and your defining image matter. And so he held up uh, France, for instance. What's the defining figure of France? Or who is the defining figure? It's Napoleon,
Mm-hmm.
arguably.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the defining image of Napoleon? Probably one of two. There's either him crossing the Alps on his war horse, or we've all seen it's kind of this tempest, and he's up, the horse is rearing up, and he's very imposing, very martial as he's leading this invasion of, I think, Austria. The other defining image of Napoleon is where he is taking the crown from the bishop and then putting it on his wife Josephine's head. That the church is not conferring authority; it's Napoleon is going to take it for himself and put it on his wife's head. And so those are one of those two things are kind of the defining image of Napoleon. And the way you define yourself based off of your national hero and the image of that hero, those have long-term
Mm-hmm.
implications. Who's the defining figure of Washington? Like I said earlier, I'm sorry, of America, it's George Washington. And what's the defining image of George Washington? Probably going to go one of two places, either crossing the Delaware or the prayer at Valley Forge. And even if both of those things, those images are mythologized in the fictional sense, there's still a lot of value that's being communicated in there, whether it's submission to the divine authority as opposed to Napoleon is going to assert himself over divine authority, or just in Washington crossing the Delaware, like, yes, he's centermost, but also the American flag is centermost. So it wasn't necessarily about him, it's about the cause. And so
Hmm. Hmm.
it's how you define yourself matters. And getting back to your question that made me think of this is we ought to be patterning ourselves after our best. And in that sense, it's Washington really is the defining figure of the American way. And
Hmm.
so we should be patting ourselves after that. That really matters if we can
Hmm.
define ourselves that way, as
Hmm.
opposed to a Napoleon type of figure.
Um, that is an interesting thought because if you spoke earlier about breaking the link, and if we are defining ourselves after Washington, who you're correct, he is the defining, I mean, he's the father of our country. And if he is truly a man of humility, and if he's truly a man of virtue and a man of values and a man who is more interested in putting the cause first above himself, as I think the painting of Crossing the Delaware displays, and the painting of Valley Forge shows this humility that he's not one who wants to put himself on a pedestal. And if he's embracing these virtues, and if we then are looking to him as a defining figure of our country, then we are emulating and we are embracing those virtues. It makes sense that if I'm somebody who is antithetical to America and antithetical to what America stands for, then I might start posing this idea that Washington's a myth, that there is this mythology to 1776. And I think at that point it flows from Washington into statements that people make, that I've heard people make. I guess I'll say it that way. Statements I've heard people make in regard to American mythology is, well, it was just old white men. That's all. It's old white men, do you want to go back to that mythology where we're just controlled by old white men? And uh, in my heart, though, they're right. Yes, it was a bunch of old white guys, but we don't hold them on a pedestal because they're old and white. We hold them in this place of reverence because of what they believed in,
Mm-hmm.
because of the values that they carried. Um, and I think for people like you and me, and I think the reason why this discussion is so important is because it's those values that we need to talk about, and it's those values that need to be carried forward. Your example here of France's defining figure and America's defining figure is a beautiful picture of polar opposites and um, what we have in our history and understanding our history, what we have in these men. And it's not just the men. I mean, there were women too who stood up and carried the torch. I think I feel like this conversation is so important is because that element has to be preserved. And I'll go back to your statement about, not breaking that chain. I think the chain has to stay intact.